Greetings in the name of the Most High Yahuwah and his Son Yahusha to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. I am Brother Hiram, and in this video I'm going to be bringing to you the third and final part of the series which I have entitled, Are We Being Partial in the Torah? Rethinking Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 through 4. And we're going to talk about Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4 in context. Now, the last series I did about put away versus divorce, the last video in that series where we asked the question, if Yahusha meant divorce, did that put him in conflict with the Torah? I laid the foundation for some things I'm going to talk about in this particular video. So if you remember, I talked about how I gave you the primer in that video, but we're going to put a couple coats of paint on in this one here because we're going to go a little deeper into Deuteronomy 24 than we did in that previous video. So as we talked about in that previous video, and we will recap this, the first two verses of Deuteronomy chapter 24 read as follows in the King James. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorce and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. So as I've said before, if somebody sees Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 as something that commands, instructs, or shows approval of Yah for divorce and remarriage, I can actually understand that. I can actually see where they're coming from. Because if all they have is the King James, then it certainly lends itself to that. But as we said in that previous video, when you look in the Hebrew, and I have a screenshot here of the Hebrew interlinear of Deuteronomy 24 verse 1, and as it reads from right to left, okay, when we look at the third line and we look at the second word in on the third line, it says wekatab in the Hebrew, and it says and he writes. It doesn't say let him write. It says and he writes. And we complete the sentence, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, and puts it, and then the next line it continues, in her hand, etc., etc. But that word, wekatab, second word in on the third line, and he writes. So that's what it says in the Hebrew text from which the King James was translated. Now, verse 2, now you see the number 2 up there, and we're reading from right to left. And so it says, and when she has departed from his house and goes, wehalaka, and goes, and becomes man's wife another. So, and goes, it doesn't say she may go. She may go, like that sounds like it's giving permission, giving approval. She may go, but here it says and goes. So once again, this is the Hebrew text from which the King James is translated. And so when we go back to where we originally were, we see highlighted, let him write her a bill of divorce. She may go be another man's wife. We know it does not say that in the Hebrew text from which this was translated. Now, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he had found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. And so this is translated from the New King James, and as I said before, that the New King James, at least in this passage, translates it much closer to the Hebrew text than the King James. Now, I'm not exalting one version over another because I don't believe there's a perfect version, a perfect translation. But at least in this passage, the New King James gets it right by accurately translating in verse 1, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. And then in verse 2, when she has departed from his house, and goes and becomes another man's wife. So why is this important? Let's look at it this way. Now we're going to stay with the New King James here. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. Verse 1, so far, no commandment, no instruction, no clear approval given from Yahuwah. This is merely a situation. Verse 2, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. Verse 2, once again, this is just a situation. Verse 3, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, now that's a condition. So you see that? Situation, situation, condition. No commandment yet. Now verse 4, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before Yahuwah, and you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahuwah your Elohim is giving you as an inheritance. So there's the command. There's the judgment. Everything else is just a situation or a condition. So everything else is a narrative that sets up the commandment or the judgment. This is why it's important that we get this from the Hebrew text. Because you have to admit, there is a difference. There is a difference in reading it like this than reading it in the King James. Because I've seen people, they read it from the King James and they are very firm on this, and they firmly stand on it, and they say that this is the law of divorce and remarriage, and they stand on it with confidence, not even knowing that it doesn't even say that in the Hebrew text. Now we're going to look at something else here. We're going to look at narrative language. Now you're going to see what I'm talking about in a minute here. Now in verse 3 of Deuteronomy 24, it says, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, verse 4, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before Yahuwah, and you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahuwah your Elohim is giving you as an inheritance. So, when I talk about narrative language, there are some who say that this second marriage was even approved of Yah because of the narrative language. We see that Yah calls the second man the latter husband, calls the first man the former husband. So that must mean that this situation had his stamp of approval. Well, once again, let's go into the Hebrew text because it's not that simple. Now here we're looking at verses 3 and 4 in the Hebrew text. And we're going to look at the word latter husband. Now, where you see the number 3, we're reading from right to left. So, the second word in, where it says Ha'ish Ha'aharon. Ha'ish Ha'aharon. That's the husband latter, or the latter husband. We see that on the first line in the second word in, and we see it on the second line in the middle. And remember that he's called an ish, which is the word for man also. So it's interchangeable, ish, husband. But look at what the former husband, the original husband, is called. Now on the third line, where it says number 4 for the fourth verse, and the third word in, he is called Bala Harishon. Bala Harishon, former husband. And so Bala meaning her husband, her Baal. And as a lot of us know, Baal means Lord, master, owner, possessor. And so my question for someone who wants to take issue with the narrative and try to say that we can use the narrative to show Yah's approval on this, then why is only the first husband given the honorable title of Baal, Lord, master, owner, possessor, but this second man is just merely called a Ish? I mean, this could even be translated as, the latter man, her latter man. But, I mean, we'll say husband just to keep it in context. But why, if this is the former, and really it could be called first husband, Rishon, all right? So if he's the former husband, then why isn't this second man the latter Baal? Why isn't he the Baal Ha'aharon? The latter Baal, latter Lord, latter master. Why isn't he given that honorable title like that as a husband? Why is this first husband the only one that's considered the Baal? Now, I think that's interesting. I do. And so the only reason I bring that out is if someone wants to take issue with narrative language, then let's go to the text and let's see, because this actually makes my point. And my point is that this is a situation that was not commanded, instructed, or even explicitly approved of by Yah, but this was suffered, this was tolerated, just like Yahusha said. Now, as we go on, now here's another verse that people try to use to show the legitimacy of divorce and remarriage. It says, and Yahusha said unto her, Go, call thy husband, and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Yahusha said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that sayest thou truly. That's out of John chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. As I said, this is another narrative that people try to use to show the legitimacy of divorce and remarriage, where it said, Thou hast had 5 husbands. So he acknowledged that she had 5 husbands. She'd been married 5 times, and these were legitimate marriages because he says that she had 5 husbands. Well, as we read further, we get into the Hebrew scriptures, we find this in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. And David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, Deliver me my wife Michal, which I espoused to me for 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, even from Phaltiel the son of Laish, and her husband went with her along, weeping behind her to Bahurim. Then said Abner unto him, Go, return. And he returned. And so here we see the term husband applied to Phaltiel, because Shaul, for whatever reason, perhaps he thought that Daud was dead, or perhaps he was just being wicked, but he took his daughter, which was Daud's wife, and married her to another man who the narrative of the scripture calls her husband, even though he wasn't her lawful husband, but it calls her husband. Now, if it's worth anything, I will say that if you look at this in the Hebrew text, that he's not called a Baal. He's called a Ish, a man, husband. He's just given the generic title of husband. He's not given the honorable title of Baal, because Daud was the Baal. Praise Yahuwah. But still, the scriptural narrative calls this man her husband, even though he was not her lawful husband. So he was just her legal husband under the rule of Michal's wicked father, King Shaul. We cannot use narrative language to prove the lawfulness of a marriage. Here we see the term husband apply to both lawful and unlawful marriages. Now, we're going to look at another aspect of this passage. If the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before Yahuwah, and you shall not bring sin on the land which Yahuwah your Elohim is giving you as an inheritance. So this is verse 3 and 4 once again, and I'm emphasizing the reason why the former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. So the issue is not even necessarily the marriage per se, but the defilement that took place within that second marriage. Now, as we look at the term defile or defilement and what the Torah says about that, so within this context, the only thing we can tie into that as a defilement would be Leviticus 18:20, where it says, "Moreover, thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife to defile thyself with her." And later on in that chapter it says, "Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you, and the land is defiled. Therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants." So that's Leviticus chapter 18, verses 20, and then 24 and 25. Now, I mentioned the land because it mentions the land in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 24. So, when we talk about a defilement that pollutes the land, within the context of Deuteronomy 24, we see that the defilement of adultery pollutes the land. And so, the reason why I bring this out is this. We're told in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4, "Marriage is honorable in the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers Elohim will judge." The scenario in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 is a very unfavorable scenario that none of us should model our lives after. As Yahushua said, it was suffered or tolerated, but not approved of. And I believe that this is a indicator that it was merely suffered and tolerated but not approved of because of the defilement that took place within the second marriage. And so, whereas marriage is supposed to be honorable in the bed undefiled. Now, I've heard it said before that, oh, she's only defiled unto the first man, so it's like a relative defilement. But I don't see anything in the Torah or in the scriptures about relative defilement. You're either defiled or you're not defiled. Review. The Hebrew text of this passage does not say, "let him or she may," as does the King James Version. This is important to note because those added words seem to give commandment, instruction, and approval to the practice of divorce and remarriage. The Hebrew text of this passage shows verses 1 and 2 to be describing, not prescribing, a divorce remarriage scenario. Verse 3 sets the condition, and verse 4 is the only verse in the passage that gives an actual commandment. Viewing this passage as an allowance and not a command, instruction, or approval brings it into harmony with the rest of the Torah and the prophets on this issue. We cannot use narrative language to justify divorce and remarriage because the scriptures use the term husband whether the marriage is lawful or unlawful. The woman in Deuteronomy chapter 24, 1 through 4 is said to be defiled in the second marriage, showing that this was not an honorable marriage, although it was suffered or tolerated by Yahuwah. Challenge questions. Where is the command, instruction, or approval for divorce and remarriage in the passage according to the Hebrew text? Not the King James now, but according to the Hebrew text. If Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 commands, instructs, or approves of divorce and remarriage, then where is a second witness in the Torah or the prophets? If in the passage the woman's second marriage was approved of Yahuwah rather than just tolerated, why is she said to be defiled if marriage is honorable in the bed undefiled? Seeing that the man in the passage could not take the woman back to be his wife after she was defiled, why was Hosea able to take Gomer back after she had been defiled? What is the difference between Hosea's situation and the situation in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4? Concluding remarks. As I said, this is the final part of the series, Are We Being Partial in the Torah? So we have completed 2 series so far. The first series was Put Away versus Divorce. In this series, Are We Being Partial in the Torah? Now, I want to give you a recap of just what my purpose is in bringing forth these series. Now, my core message is that the core teaching of Yahushua regarding divorce and remarriage, Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, whosoever puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and the woman who puts away her husband and marries another commits adultery. And Luke 16:18, whosoever puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whosoever marries her who's put away from her husband commits adultery. This is the core teaching of Yahushua regarding divorce and remarriage. But the problem is those very words which I just spoke to you have been made of none effect through the traditions of men. And so what I have done so far is I've dealt with a couple of traditions of men. I dealt with an old tradition here of using Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 to circumvent what Yahushua said. And then I dealt with a newer tradition at the first with put away versus divorce, where people are putting forth the idea that Yahushua did not mean divorce. He only meant putting away without a divorce certificate, which pretty much justifies about everything that's out there. And so the words of Yahushua have been made of none effect through tradition. And what I am doing is I'm undoing these traditions. But I have one more series to go where I'm going to deal with Matthew 19. Now, this is going to be last, but certainly not least. I'm going to deal with some of these things that I mentioned in my testimony. I'm going to deal with what Yah revealed to me about Matthew 19:9 and how that Matthew 19:9 does not change Yahushua's core teaching in Mark 10, verses 11 and 12, and Luke 16, verse 18. So stay tuned for that teaching series. And this ends part 3 of the series, Are We Being Partial in